Thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar, Planning for High Quality Evaluation of Professional Learning, hosted by the Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance. This is the first in a series of 3 webinars about planning high-quality evaluations of professional learning. This session will focus on establishing the purpose for evaluation. We have 2 wonderful presenters today. Candice Bocala is a Senior Research Associate at WestEd and has experience as a program evaluator as well as in professional development for teachers and school leaders. She focuses on understanding the organizational conditions that support professional learning. Katrina Bledsoe is a research scientist and evaluation specialist at Education Development Center. She received her PhD from Claremont Graduate University in psychology with a concentration in applied social psychology and specialization in evaluation research. I'll be turning this over to Katrina in just a minute. My name is Nicole Breslow, and Candice and I lead the REL Professional Learning and Development Research Alliance, which is hosting today's webinar. The purpose of this alliance is to support district leaders from the Northeast region to make evidence-based decisions regarding the selection, adaptation, scale-up, and/or discontinuation of professional development programs and interventions. And I see that we have a number of members of our alliance here today, which is great to see. And for now, I will turn it over to Katrina to get started with today's presentation.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, and I want to make sure that everyone can see the slides. I'm unsure, so let me see if I can't get that straight. Okay. All right. So today's webinar that we're working on is looking at really trying to plan for high-quality evaluation of professional learning. And we'll be really trying to support district leaders from the Northeast region to make evidence-based decisions and be able to adapt and scale up professional development programs and interventions. So our agenda today is first, of course, trying to give you an overview of evaluation, also starting to focus on what to evaluate, and then understanding some of the what it means by goals and outcomes, trying to make some distinctions between there, and then understanding logic models, which of course we've all heard of, and then also trying to understand what it takes to develop good evaluation questions, because that actually underlies a lot of the work that we do in terms of professional development and any other type of evaluation. And then finally, conclusions and next steps. This is a part of a series of evaluation that that we'll be looking at, a 3-part series, which looks across at several different aspects. And I'm trying to share my screen here. Jenny and Nicole, I can't seem to see it on my end. Can you actually give me a shot of the screen, because I'm having problems sharing my screen?
Hi, Katrina. This is Candice. We can all see the screen just fine. So we're on the webinar sequence.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. This is a little bit of a difference here. So in that case, we'll be looking at 3 different aspects. This first part will look at trying to get folks on board about evaluation questions, just have a general understanding. And then also the second one will be a little bit more on understanding data and what type of data it will take to answer some of those questions. And then the third part that we'll be doing in January will also focus on what it takes to be a little bit of understanding evaluation and what you're getting in terms of evaluation and how to commission it and bring it forth. So we'll begin from there. I think I'm having a little bit of problems with trying to go further. So.
Katrina, this is Candice again. I can advance your slides. We're on the goal slide.
Thank you. That would be great. I'm sorry. I'm having a little problem from my end trying to advance my slides. Okay. And Candice, I'm actually having trouble seeing the slides.
Sure. So hold on. I'm going to have our tech support step in to help you, and I'll just talk about the goals for our participants. Today's goals are to be introduced to a process for planning and evaluation, to discuss considerations when determining the scope and the process of the evaluation, to discuss how logic models are useful in planning this evaluation, and then to end with developing evaluation questions. We realize that this is certainly not all that goes into planning for evaluation, so that's why we have the 3 webinars. If you attend all 3 of them, we'll be able to walk you through the entire model. So just starting off with a couple of terms in terms of introducing why we use certain terms in this webinar. The first one is the word evaluation. It can be helpful to distinguish between 3 commonly related words: evaluation, research, and assessment. So evaluation is typically defined as the systematic investigation about the merit, worth, or significance of a policy or program. This is different from conducting research, which usually is directed toward greater knowledge or understanding or theory. The idea is that evaluation and research are both systematic studies requiring data collection and analysis, but usually evaluation is targeted more toward looking at the impact of a specific policy or program, and you may not generalize to broader theory, but research is aimed at building that knowledge in the field. And then assessment is the appraisal of current status by which you collect evidence, but this may or may not involve formal measurement, so you could also do assessment more informally. So today we're going to be talking about evaluation. Another commonly used term is professional development. So there's good research on professional development, and it is designed to increase teachers' knowledge and skills to become more effective educators. It's usually focused on what Schulman calls teachers' pedagogical content knowledge, or their understanding of how to teach particular subject matter and how students learn that content. And then the research on high-quality professional development, meaning it has certain characteristics, such as it builds teachers' pedagogical content knowledge over a sustained period of time, occurs in learning communities where teachers are given opportunities to actively try out, plan, or present new instructional approaches. That kind of professional development has the potential to have a positive relationship to student achievement outcomes. So in our alliance, as we work with stakeholders here in the Northeast region, we use the term professional learning in addition to professional development. This is because professional development has become associated with a kind of workshop model of one-shot opportunities for teachers to go outside of their school to learn content or skills, as opposed to an idea that teachers' professional learning is really sustained and integrated both in school and out of school. And so our alliance chose to use the term professional learning and development in our name, and we'll also be using the acronym PLD to stand for Professional Learning and Development in this webinar. So the first thing we want to do is just hear from you about your experiences with evaluation and specifically trying to evaluate a kind of professional learning development activity in your context. So we're going to move over to a chat to get your input. So if you could tell us, what experience have you had with evaluating professional learning and development? Have you ever participated in program evaluation? Has it been about PLD or not about PLD? And then over on the right side, were you satisfied with the results of the evaluation? Why or why not? What happened as you were working on the evaluation? So I'm seeing some people weigh in here. It looks like we actually have a kind of even split in our audience today, ranging from those who have never been part of a program evaluation to people who have participated, but it wasn't about professional learning, to about 23% of people who have participated in evaluating a professional learning activity, and even 22% of people who have commissioned or conducted a program evaluation. And looking at the chat results, I see that Karen has talked about needing to collect better data. And then if you can have better data, you can have findings that better support school leaders to provide that support to educators. And then Susan is saying, we collected data, but we didn't do anything with it. Not sure what to do with the data or how to use the data to strengthen TLD. So some of you, I think, might also be adding in your responses to the chat. It's useful to hear from our audience how many people have thought about evaluation in these ways. Another response from Diana, you weren't entirely satisfied, wasn't clear we had responses that we needed, not sure about outcomes, and then Kim was talking about not sure how useful the results were. So all of these are concerns that we're going to address in our webinar over the course of these 3 sessions. They're very common concerns, and so I think one of the arguments that we'll be making today is that it is important to plan for evaluation as you are considering what professional learning activities you're using in your district. A great point here is that somebody said, Andrea said, we didn't ask the right questions in the first place. So that's a big component of what we'll be talking about today. There's lots of other great ideas in that chat, but we're going to have to move along. Don't worry, you'll have more opportunities to tell us about your experience in just a moment.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm back. Had a little problem there. But this is Katrina, and then we just wanted to discuss a little bit about why do we conduct evaluations, because often people are asked for evaluations and for a lot of variety of reasons, and people aren't always understanding under what circumstances you might ask for an evaluation. A lot of it can be reporting to external and internal agencies for funding, for policy, and sometimes just for general improvement about how to improve the implementation if we want to learn more, and also to monitor how well things are going and to be able to make change. And then the third reason that people always ask for an evaluation is they want to know about people's performance or performance of something or a program, whether they want to expand something or replicate it, or sometimes whether or not just to let the program or the initiative or strategies go. So those are some of the reasons that we might actually conduct evaluations. A lot of times I think people always have the idea that you're going to conduct an evaluation to determine the worth of something, but it really is about trying to gain learning and gain understanding about what's needed. So usually when we're trying to pull together an evaluation, there's usually a general sort of a strategy about looking at evaluation. And we call it the continuous evaluation model. And it's usually about 5 steps. And you may see some others that may be more steps, but these are generally 5 steps that people usually like to work with in evaluation, which is first that you're going to define what it is that you need, what's the purpose of the evaluation, and what's the logic of the program. Why have you even embarked upon the program itself? Then we start trying to plan about what kind of questions we want to answer, if you're going to invest in an evaluation, and also how will you answer them. And then 3, we're concerned about implementation. How should data be collected and analyzed? Who are you going to collect it from? And then interpretation is how will the results be used and communicated? Who are going to be the folks that you're going to be talking to? And there may be a wide variety of folks. And then finally, we use it to sort of inform or refine what can be done or improved about the program. And you'll see that it's a continuous learning model in the sense that it's not something that just ends. It's something that we would assume that people do continuously to continuously inform and learn as we go along.
Thanks,
so
Katrina.
I think we're going, yep. Go ahead.
Today we're going to walk through each of these steps, starting with step 1, which is define, deciding what to evaluate. I also want to point out that that 5-step model has a few guiding questions that we're going to present today, and you can download a handout in the download files box, which is right below the slides. Handout number 1 has some of the guiding questions that we'll be talking through today, and you can use that as you plan for evaluating your own programs, and it will provide a structure for how to think about those 5 steps. So starting with step 1, we thought that the best way to practice is to give you an experience with a scenario from a real district here in the Northeast. We're going to be talking about this scenario, which is going to be given the name the STEM Partnership Program. This is a real program here in the Northeast in a large urban district, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this program so that you can get a sense of what these teachers and community members are doing. You can also download a complete scenario from the download files pod called Handout 2. And Handout 2 has all of the text that we'll be using about the professional learning scenario. So it might be helpful to open that up as we go through our examples today, because we will be doing some real practice. And we're going to be asking for your input in thinking out loud about how you would structure an evaluation of this program. So let me tell you a little bit about the STEM Partnership. This is a collaborative professional learning effort. It was designed to support middle and high school science, mathematics, engineering, and technology, or the acronym STEM. It operated in a large urban district because teachers and school leaders and parents were concerned that not enough students were entering high school with the skills they needed to be successful in those STEM fields. They were also facing budgetary and resource constraints and concerned that students didn't have access to engaging in rigorous STEM learning opportunities. So part of this program was a partnership between universities, so higher education, the large urban public school district, and some supporting organizations like a research hospital, an engineering company, and it also involved parents and the community. Members of the STEM Partnership really hoped that they would engage middle school students in STEM content early and keep them interested throughout high school. So the way they did this was to focus primarily on building the content and pedagogical knowledge of middle and high school teachers. The main professional learning activities included teachers spending summers in workshops at the universities conducting interdisciplinary research. University students, so these were the higher education students who were studying STEM, would come to work with teachers to support planning and design of inquiry-based curriculum. And then teachers and the university faculty would participate in professional learning communities throughout the year. These professional learning communities also included volunteers from the community and parents. And finally, university students were assigned to support each school by working with the younger students, the middle and high school students, in after-school and science clubs. So all of these things were going on in this example professional learning program. So we'll come back to the scenario throughout our webinar, but keep that idea in mind of what this group was trying to do and what they were trying to accomplish. So in step 1, the first thing you need to do is answer a few guiding questions. The first is, what is the program and why do the evaluation? It's important to know the intention behind the evaluation so you can think about the intended audiences and how the evaluation results will be used. It's important to start thinking about this right away as you are embarking on a new professional development planning effort. So given the scenario I just described and the information in Handout 2, we'd like you to tell us what are some possible purposes for the evaluation of this program. Why might somebody in the community or somebody working in the schools or the universities want to evaluate this program? There's a chat area below the slides here, and we'd love to hear your ideas. As you're generating your responses, think about who might want these evaluations. So Kim is saying a funder might require one. That's a great point. This was actually funded by the National Science Foundation, and I'm sure that as a condition of their funding, they were required to do an evaluation. Another Kim talked about expansion. So I'm interested to hear more about what you might learn from the evaluation that would lead you to do expansion. So I think some people can say, we'd like to know whether this has an impact on teachers. We'd like to know whether this has an impact on our students before we expand it. Lots of different purposes. To find out if teachers are learning, to to determine if strategies are effective. The State Department might want this evaluation to understand the effectiveness of school improvement. So great, lots of different purposes for evaluating the program. Some of these are based on the funder or the stakeholder group that might have a reason for wanting it, and some of them might be based on the program itself wanting to make improvements. So all of those are great purposes. Thanks. We'll move on to our next example here. So we can close the chat.
Thanks, Candice. Those are some great responses, I think, in terms of why people commission evaluation, and in particular in response to our sort of case study there. But there are a lot of different types of evaluations as well, and you may have heard of a few of them. Ones are needs, and these are the most common: needs assessments, process evaluations, outcome, and impact. And we'll make a little bit of a distinction between all of them. Needs assessments are those of trying to determine what needs to be done, a little bit more exploratory and getting a sense of what's really out there or what's really happening. Process is really tied to implementation and how well things are being implemented. For instance, it may be how well a new curriculum is being implemented on a day-by-day basis. Outcome, and both of those former two that I just mentioned are considered what they call formative evaluations. They're at the beginning or somewhere in the middle. The summative evaluation aspects are outcomes and impact. Outcomes are usually about, is there a change based on sort of the program or a behavior being part of a particular professional learning development opportunity? Did we get an outcome from there? And then finally, impact is usually what people usually say, and both of those get conflated at times in the sense that impacts are much larger and much longer term. And it might be something about, did our professional learning development actually impact our students' final outcomes? That's more at the impact level. So those four differences. In a lot of instances, most will probably fall in the first three, and the impact is usually at a longer term. So some of the things that we talk a little bit about, sort of going back to the this idea about what questions you want to ask and what type of evaluation you want to have, is who all is interested in it and who should be at the table. So we call it a seat at the table, and who are your stakeholders and who are the audience. In a lot of instances, when we're trying to identify stakeholders, we really have to ask who really is caring about this evaluation and why. And sometimes that can be a funder might have that, might be the driver on it. It might be the teachers, and in some instances it might be aspects that have to do directly with student outcomes. We're also who is invested in the program or initiative itself, and then also who has the decision-making authority. Even though we all might have stakeholders, some stakeholders might have a little bit more investment than others. So some of those examples that we have are teachers benefiting from recommendations to improve programs, boards of education using evaluation results. Those are some of the reasons that, and some of the stakeholders who might be invested in what we do and how we're doing it. So with that, with stakeholders, and we all know that stakeholders are very, those are usually the folks who are most invested in an evaluation. You simply don't just do one just to do one. We're very interested in understanding how much of a level of engagement do you want from stakeholders. And it ranges, and this actually is a sort of a continuum based on some of the work that's been done by the National Institutes of Health, but certainly is actually very applicable to education, which is going from outreach all the way to shared leadership. With outreach, we're really talking about trying to sort of outreach to participants, but they don't have as much say or involvement. When we consult with people, that might mean bringing them in and giving them particular information as we move through. And then involving folks would be actually having them maybe be a seat on the evaluation itself. And then collaboration is a little bit much more of a shared sort of a shared agenda where both the evaluation team and everyone who's commissioned the evaluation is looking to collaborate and actually in some ways figure out how best to do the evaluation and what's needed. And then in best case scenario, shared leadership really works to the advance of trying to having the school district, for instance, might be the actual driver of the evaluation and how data is collected, and in a lot of instances how the evaluation is developed. So those are some of the level of engagement that sort of work with our stakeholders. So understanding how people want to work together is key. And I'm going to turn it over to Candice. I believe actually that's still me with the chat there. So with the STEM partnership, so sort of going back to our case study a little bit, and going back to all the folks that we had sort of identified in there who might be involved, you have university students, teachers, and a variety of folks, for instance. Who are some of the stakeholders that are involved in the program, and why might they be interested in the evaluation? And we were given a little bit of room to the chat. I'm hoping that some folks will sort of type great. You see some typing going on.
So one thing that strikes me about this program is the number of stakeholders involved. Many districts have coalitions, multiple groups, organizations working together to support professional development. It's not just the district and the teachers driving professional development anymore. It's coming in from all kinds of sources, community sources, universities. And so I see some people are starting to put their thoughts into the chat.
Right. Violet, I think Rob says teachers are involved. Violet talks about that educators have limited time, and that would be a great way to increase buy-in if they felt it was worth it. Linda says community partners are there. Deborah talks about districts and local boards, and then Diana talks about the fact that they have labor management committees that work together on those processes. And then Lynn talks about the justification of obtaining funders for state legislature. And then even Martha mentioned middle and high school counselors have a stake in this as well. So I think that's a really big deal about how many stakeholders are involved and what level of engagement they want. Sometimes people don't want as much level of engagement, but that's becoming sort of a little bit old hat these days. A lot of folks are beginning to realize that they have a big stake in what they want to do. So, and thanks, Andres, University Partners as well. So thank you for those comments, and then we'll keep those in mind, and we'll continue on. Candice?
Great. So for the first, I was talking there for a little bit and I was on mute. But the next step is to use logic models. The first step that Katrina talked about was to define the program and to figure out who are the stakeholders who are interested in the program and make sure they have a seat at the table so that you can invite them to discussions about the evaluation. But in this step is to think about how would you draw the boundaries of the program? How would you describe the program in terms of the activities, their outcomes, and what the program is trying to accomplish? And for that, logic models are a really good resource. So what is a logic model? Logic models are tools as a way to diagram the theory behind the program. One might expect to happen in the program, as well as how much and what kind of resources are needed. The way we think about a logic model is it's a kind of roadmap or the frame of a house. So you couldn't build a house without having a strong structure or foundation. And often logic models are graphic or visual representations of the relationships, the assumptions, and the rationale for the program. And there are some great resources about building logic models, including some from the Kellogg Foundation, as well as a guide from REL Northeast Islands that we'll be referring to here that was developed by Shackman and Rodriguez. So in its simplest form, a logic model contains three components: inputs, strategies, and outcomes. The inputs are what is invested in the program, thinking about resources such as money and people; strategies, meaning what is done in the program or the program activities; and the outcomes, what results from the program. And we'll be more specific by separating those into short and long-term outcomes. You can represent this visually by creating a table. And usually the elements of the logic model are organized around the problem statement. So what is guiding the reason that this program exists? Why do we have this program? What problem are we trying to solve in our district or our community that requires this program? And then you can organize your components from left to right. And we are going to spend a little bit of time going through each of these components in just a moment to give you some examples from the STEM partnership scenario. And then grounding the logic model are assumptions. Assumptions are really interesting because they are almost the implicit ways of thinking about the program that sometimes are not made visible or not talked about until you start to really dig into how do we expect this program to operate. So the assumptions go at the bottom. So I'm going to turn it over to Katrina, who's going to walk us a little bit through each of the elements of the logic model. And I do want to remind you that another handout we have for you is the completed logic model that you're going to see her build out. So if you want to follow along with us, you can download this handout from the Download Files pod at the bottom.
Right. So thanks, Candice. So you'll see the handout that we're working off of. But we are going to build it out a little bit. Candice and I will sort of take turns sort of building out parts of that. So Candice talked a little bit about the assumptions about how the program works or what are some of the explicit aspects of that. And that underlies a lot of the logic model, which is why it's at the bottom. But one of the elements of the logic model is the problem statement. And in a lot of instances, people don't always mention that. But it's really about what's the problem or the challenge or the program or the strategies that are being designed to address. What's the problem of the issue? Why is this a problem? Who is the problem? Who is the problem for? And who has a stake in the problem? In some cases, we understand that sometimes the problem is why funders might address it, but it may not necessarily be a problem for the folks who might be part of it. And then also trying to know what is known about the problem. So when you're developing a problem statement, all that underlies it, and it's really informed by all of that, including some of the historical aspects, such as what's been done previously, what research has been done, what programs have been done, and from there, you develop a problem statement. Sometimes there may be more than one problem statement, but there's usually an overarching one that you can work with as to why there's an issue. So as we move towards the logic model example here, going back to our case study, we've sort of defined the problem statement here as students in the district do not have enough access to high-quality learning experiences in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, otherwise known as STEM, as they transition from middle to high school. So that's the problem that we have sort of set up. And how might we address that since we're saying that they don't have enough access to that? What would we be looking for from there? And then from there, we start to try and build out the logic model. Keep in mind that the logic model is sort of the beginning roadmap to the evaluation of where you're going to go and how you're going to approach it. So with the elements of the logic model, moving on to strategies and activities, sort of after you've developed the problem statement, how are you going to address the problem? What is going to be done? So in that case, we're talking about students not having enough access. What are some of the activities, services, events, products, trainings that are designed to address the problem? And if they're pulled together, how will they address certain outcomes, and what outcomes would they address? So let's go back to our logic model there. And in this case, we have said, we've built out the problem just a little bit more, and we've said that students of color, and female students in particular, tend to be underrepresented in STEM fields in higher education. So we built it out just a little bit more after sort of thinking about some of the strategies and activities. So in this case, we're thinking as summer workshops, mentoring, professional learning communities, inquiry-based lessons, and then STEM field trips and activities as possible strategies and activities that could address that problem statement. And then from there, in a lot of instances, we want to know that we've actually done something and actually have been able to accomplish some activities. So the outputs, and often outputs and outcomes sometimes get conflated and they get confused, but the outputs are the immediate results of the activities in the logic model. So these are concrete, measurable outcomes or evidence that something occurred. So it could be number of teachers attended, number of workshops held, number of students who participated. Those are the outputs. They don't necessarily talk about anything about change in behavior or change in actual attitude or the way that things are done, but they simply are letting folks know what has been done or who was there and how many things actually occurred. So if we look at our logic model here as we're starting to build it out, so you see the strategies, which makes perfect sense of moving from the strategies. Well, if we have summer workshops and mentoring and professional learning communities and all of that, we have the number of teachers participating, the number of summer workshops and PLCs that are held, the number of lessons created, the number of university mentors, and the number of activities and number of field trips. So those will be outputs of after we've held all these, we've done these strategies and we've held these activities, what can we expect in terms of numbers? So I'm going to turn it over to Candice. I think, Candice, you're talking a little bit about the outcome.
Yes. So the outcomes ask the question, what difference does this program make in the short term, the long term, and then what is the ultimate impact of the program? Together, these can tell you, besides just the immediate outputs, which Katrina mentioned, are often categorized in terms of numbers, this can really tell you about results that happen down the line. We often distinguish between short-term and long-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes happening within the most immediate time frame, and this varies by program. Sometimes short-term outcomes are in the next month, to the next year, to the next 2 years. And then longer-term outcomes could be maybe 3 or more years out, but this again depends on the life cycle of your program. If you have a program lasting for several years, you might be looking at more long-term outcomes in terms of maybe 5 or more years. So impact is that longest-term outcome that tries to get at why you decided to use this program in the first place. Is the impact ultimately getting you to solve your problem, to address the problem that you tried to create this professional development or professional learning activity to try to solve? So we would like you to think about what are some possible outcomes for the STEM partnership. So we've talked you through the problem, the strategies and activities, and the outputs. So what might be some short and long-term outcomes for the STEM partnership? What comes to mind as you think about maybe what is this group trying to achieve? Don't forget that they were partnering with universities. They had teachers participating in summer workshops to create science lessons. They had students being mentored by university graduate students. They had students going on field trips. They also had students trying out after-school activities in STEM. So if those were the key strategies and activities, what are some possible outcomes that they might be hoping for? So Anita's talking about increasing interest in STEM careers. Yep, and I think if I were to categorize that, that probably would be something you might start to see in the short term, maybe students expressing, maybe I want to go into marine biology or I want to go into engineering. But then in the long term, you could see if they actually apply for those kinds of careers. Improvement on standardized science assessments. Yep, Karen is talking about a very common kind of outcome that we might be hoping for, to see those students' science assessment scores increase. We are also looking at increasing course taking in STEM. Glenn's comment, improved teacher pedagogical content knowledge. That's a really important one to remember, because often when we think about outcomes, we think about, when we're talking about professional development, we think about student outcomes, but teachers have outcomes as well. Susan is echoing that point. She wants to see teachers beginning to use those new strategies and activities in practice. Those are more short-term outcomes. Revisions to college courses so that concerns stated in the evaluation are addressed in the college's coursework. That's a really interesting idea from Cheryl, because if universities are a partner in this professional development program, they could adjust their college coursework so that they know what students coming in from high school need as they enter into the university level. So all of those things are really great ideas. Thank you for sharing those. I want to highlight Kim's point too. Another outcome is the partnerships in the community. Obviously, this particular program was all about getting community members to work together with the schools, and so that is certainly an outcome that they're hoping for. So we'll go on to talk about the other two parts of the logic model that we're not going to have as much time to give you examples for, but I do want to point out that in your handout, each of these components is represented, so you can see an example of a completed logic model. One component is called the resources, so these are the inputs. These are all about the material contributions or intangible contributions that help us create the program to address the problem. This might include common resources like money, materials. It can also include people and time and the partnerships that are created. And so you'll see that in our logic model example that we filled out that resources column. And then the last component of a logic model has to do with assumptions. So what beliefs are at play as we think about this program? A good way to get at assumptions is to just ask, what do we know about this program and what are we assuming? How are we reading between the lines to try to make this program work? And a good way to talk about assumptions is to actually look at an example. So this is the completed logic model. A big assumption in this program is that the professional learning that teachers receive is of high quality. So we can't assume that teachers will have better classroom practices and that students will have improved interest in STEM if we don't have strong professional learning experiences. So that's a big assumption in this program. And that's an example of the kind of thing you would think about as you're building out your assumptions. So just concluding a couple of final thoughts on logic models. Logic models are really helpful tools at all stages of program development. They can help with program design, they can help with implementation, but today we're really talking about using them for evaluation. It's also really important to keep your stakeholders engaged in developing a logic model. Sometimes this is an activity that it's tempting to rely on an evaluator or a researcher to develop a logic model by themselves. But if you get stakeholder input, you're going to get a much closer view of the program, and you're going to get closer to unpacking those assumptions. Often stakeholders have these ideas in their heads that they may not realize are part of the model until you get them talking about it. Logic models should be living documents, meaning they should be revised and returned to frequently over time as you come to understand your program. And we know that logic models are useful for evaluation, but really you should develop them when you're first designing the program. So going back to our point here in this webinar, that you should be thinking about evaluation right when you launch a new program or a new initiative. Evaluation should not be an afterthought. It should go hand in hand with designing the program. So we're going to move on to our next step in our 5-step evaluation model, which is plan.
Right, so we're moving on to step 2, which is planning the evaluation. And remember, we said that step 2 was starting to think about developing good evaluation questions, and just sort of reiterating Candice's point about evaluation being at the very beginning. I know it can be a little bit intimidating at times, but that also helps about how you're going to measure and then keep track of the changes and be able to provide good information over time that you can get a jump on instead of having to react to, and you can be a little bit more proactive. But the second piece is developing a good evaluation question. What is a good evaluation question? And sort of moving from the logic model. The logic model sets you up for the evaluation questions that you want to use. So sort of going back to our beginning, formative questions are those that are asked while the program is operating. You might hear those, might hear people talk about those in terms of process questions, and they're usually about program improvement or mid-course correction. An example that we have here is, what's the teacher's experience of the PLD? So it's a little bit more at the beginning or in the middle of things and not so much as an end goal. And it helps people to make adjustments if things aren't going well, or if things are going well, how do you actually increase what's going well? Then there's summative questions, which are asked at the end of a program or at the end of a strategy or an initiative, and it's focused on results and outcomes. The example we have here is, did the PLD lead to changes in teachers' instructions? So now you're looking at, hey, was there a real change over time after having participated in this program or this PLD? So going back to our case study with the STEM partnership, what are some possible formative evaluation questions, and what are some possible summative evaluation questions that could be used? Remember, they're trying to actually make some changes here, but they also want to know outcomes in terms of access, but they also want to be able to know how's the process going. So maybe folks can do a little bit in the chat and think about some of the formative evaluation questions and some possible summative evaluation questions. And I'm thinking that I know that Martha and Candice and a few other folks are talking about that always want to know about how some of the workshops are going and timing of workshops. Those are some good formative questions, as well as summative questions. I'd like to know, so what are the outcomes that we expect after the first session? Can be a sort of a formative question, and then finally, what can you expect over the long term? So Candice actually says, how many teachers can complete training and how many apply use techniques? And then summative, and that's what was her formative question, and then summative were student impact, academic, and then also for, I think Martha talked about, excuse me, that wasn't Candice, excuse me, Martha, that was you, who was thinking about how many teachers complete training and how many apply use techniques. Summative, student impacts, academic, that's great. Linda, you're thinking formative, what is working versus what is not working, great. Stephanie, formative, do participants believe the PD is relevant? Do participants believe that PD will be valuable to the job? Great, thanks so much for those. And I see multiple folks are still typing as well. Gail, thank you for the formative, what's the level of engagement in PD sessions? Nancy, number of teachers providing appropriate academic accommodations in lab settings. So appreciate those definitely, and I think that that's really helpful. And it's helpful to be specific. I think Candice actually is typing in there and saying it's helpful to be specific about what is working and what's not working. And if you're interested in the teacher's learning and the community engagement. And then Stephanie with a summative, did the PD participant change practice as a result of the PD? Great question as well. And then Anita, Another formative question, are students participating? And then a summative question, do students' aspirations change? Great question. Thank you so much. So I'm going to move it along just a little bit here, and I believe that goes over to Candice, and we'll talk a little bit about Guskey's model.
Yes, thank you. So many of the questions that you generated actually fit along a continuum that Thomas Guskey developed based on some work by Kirkpatrick that's widely used now to evaluate professional development. And many of you may have seen this before, but I like to go through it just because it's so useful to think about the levels of professional development outcomes. So if you think about level 1, Guskey would argue that the first level you would want to evaluate at the end of professional development is some kind of reaction by participants, in this case teachers, also university faculty member and university students. Did they like it? Was their time well spent? Did they feel like this was a valuable opportunity? That's a really easy way to get quick feedback at the end of a workshop or at the end of a professional learning community meeting. And these are all related to satisfaction. So level 2 is going a little bit deeper. So now if they liked it, did they acquire the intended knowledge and skills? Did they actually learn something new from your professional learning effort? Did teachers learn about inquiry-based lesson planning, for example? Or did they learn how university laboratories operate, and they can give those examples to their students? Level 3 is a really interesting level in Guskey's model because it's actually not just about the teachers, it's about the organization. Level 3 is asking, did the schools that these teachers work in provide support and resources for teachers to be able to implement what they've learned? And the reason why level 3 is so important is because even if teachers liked the professional development and they learned something from the professional development, if the school conditions are not right for implementation, they're not going to have a chance to integrate this into their instructional practice. And so as a part of Guskey's model, he suggests evaluating at level 3 to get a sense of what did the school do after the teachers came back with this knowledge. Did they provide them with planning time to meet in their professional learning communities, for example? Did they provide them with material resources for students to go out on their STEM field trips, to go to engineering facilities and museums? All of those things are important because without those, you wouldn't be able to fully implement this program. Level 4 is a more common kind of reaction or level, and that is all about participant implementation at the level of practice or instruction in our case. So did the teachers effectively plan their inquiry-based science lessons, and did they use the university partners as good models and role models in their classrooms to apply what they've learned in their STEM partnership? And then level 5, again, is probably the most common outcome that we think about, and that's the level of student learning. What was the impact on our students' science assessment scores? What was the impact on our students' interest in STEM as a career and as a field? What was the impact on students' application to STEM programs after they graduated from high school? So that's the farthest level in terms of Guskey's model. And a big component of why we look at this is that when people think about evaluation, sometimes we jump all the way to levels 4 and 5. We want to know what teachers did with the use of their knowledge, and we want to know what students learned, but we forget about some of these other levels, such as did teachers acquire the knowledge and skill to begin with, and then did the school provide the resources and support for them to be able to implement? So all of these levels are useful to think about as we consider professional learning and development. And it's also helpful to note that the Guskey levels do connect to the logic model in terms of giving you a nice picture for moving from short-term outcomes that you might measure, such as participant satisfaction at level 1, to your longer-term outcomes, such as organizational impact, participant implementation, and then ultimate impact, which is why did you create this program in the first place? It's to support students learning in STEM. So in terms of creating good evaluation questions, here are some guidelines that we would recommend. The first is to think about, can this question be answered given the program you're trying to evaluate? Sometimes our questions are broad, and it's important to be sure that they are, you're asking questions that are practical, not just a generic question like, does this program make a difference? But you might become more specific and ask, does this program support our district with involving universities and faculty in STEM? You would also think about, are the questions of high priority? Are they questions that will help you make decisions, that will help you decide whether to scale up the program, whether to cut back on the program, or whether to improve the program? You might think about, are questions clear and free of jargon? It's really important, especially if you're involving stakeholders, which we would recommend, that your questions be understandable to a broad audience. And then, again, are the questions practical and appropriate for the capacity you have to answer them? So this idea here is, if you're asking a question like, how do our students perform in comparison with other students in other districts, you might want to be sure that you have the data and the capacity to analyze the data before you ask that kind of question. So you would think about who in your organization, in your district or your school, has the knowledge to be able to ask, to be able to analyze those questions, and make sure that you're asking questions that you have the capacity to answer. Another criteria is to think about, are your questions coming from your logic model? So after you develop your logic model, that is a really important place to start as you consider developing evaluation questions. And it's important to be able to think about the connection between the logic model and your questions, which is something we're going to go into a lot more in our next session. So the last consideration for good evaluation questions is asking, are these questions measurable? Are there things that we can gather data to try to understand? Is there some way that we can quantify or capture by asking people what they think about these questions? We should be able to gather data to answer any evaluation questions that we have. So those are some criteria for creating good evaluation questions. And now it's your turn again. We'd like to hear a little bit from you in terms of your understanding what kinds of evaluation questions you might ask about the STEM Partnership Program. So you have two options here. One is, we'd like to think about which of these is the most helpful formative evaluation question for the STEM partnership. You have a poll below that question, poll number 1. And then the second one is, which of those questions is the most helpful summative evaluation question for the STEM partnership? And we'll see what you vote on. You won't be able to see your results because we are hiding them. We are trying to avoid some groupthink. We'd like for you to consider each of these on your own and tell us, what do you think is the most helpful question? Remember those criteria. So are these questions connected to the logic model? Are they answerable or measurable using data? Are they of high priority so that it will help the program make decisions? Which of these questions does that the best? So we'll give you a couple of minutes here. I'm seeing that I'm not able to fool. It appears that Candice has lost her audio. Is Katrina still on the line?
I am. Sorry about that. Yes. So just sort of looking at some of the questions there. I think we may have gotten everybody. I see that there may still be a couple folks who are making some decisions. And I see that, let's just see, I can go ahead and call those out, unless Candice, you want to call those out? I think Candice is still on.
Yes, nope, I'm here. Yeah, I'm here.
All right.
So
excellent.
What what we have here, we can broadcast the results because we have some obvious answers, I think. So we can go ahead and turn those on, and you can see what everybody voted on. The first poll here is about the formative question, the best formative question. And the majority picked, how did teachers experience the university lab partnership? That makes a lot of sense because we want to know if teachers were satisfied. That would be Guskey's level 1. And also, did they learn something from that university lab partnership? And eventually we'll be asking them to think about how would they apply it, but that's a little bit further along. So that's definitely the most helpful evaluation question. Another helpful, a less helpful evaluation question in this case is the first question, even though we got some people thinking that that was a good question. This question is, what is the impact of the STEM partnership on student achievement? The point here is that's a great question, but it's a summative question. It's a kind of question you probably would need the program to operate for a little while before you can figure out whether or not it actually has that impact. And so you wouldn't ask that right away. And then the last question, where does the funding for the STEM partnership come from? That's not a super helpful question because you can answer that in a pretty straightforward way. You could find out by asking district or university partners, where do you get your funding? And it really doesn't help you make any decisions about improvement or analyze what is going on for the people in this program. So the second summative evaluation question, I also was not able to fool you here because most people selected, how did STEM partnership affect students' understanding of scientific careers? So this is a great summative question. I think some people proposed it earlier because it's looking at the longer term outcomes. Students, after having participated in this program, hopefully will go on to undertake STEM careers in college or farther out. So you could look at that after the program has been operating for several years. You could also decide to use that to justify more funding for the program, justify continuing the program, or justify replicating the program in another site. A few of you selected the question, what resources do schools need in order to support inquiry-based science and math? That's a really interesting choice, and that's a question that leaders of the program might answer. Perhaps the district coordinators of the program might try to understand this, but it's not really an evaluation question because, again, we might consider this to be something that we would think about in planning the program. We might think about this as we were first instituting the program in schools. And then the first question, which groups in our community need to be involved, is another question that we would be thinking about as we plan the program right at the beginning. It's not a longer term evaluation question that tells us the success of the program or the merit or worth of the program. So thank you for putting in your responses to the poll. We'll go back to our slides. And
all right.
Yep, now we're wrapping up.
Yeah, I think we're wrapping up here. And so hopefully we'll have some opportunities for questions. And remember, this is part one of a 3-part series that we're working at. So we look forward to having everyone back. But what we've tried to cover here is just sort of to get people on board with what's the purpose of an evaluation, getting folks to really understand the differences between sort of goals and outcomes and evaluation. Sort of unveiling a little bit of that dark mask of the logic model and taking a little bit of the sting out of that. And then evaluation questions, going through that and really trying to get a sense of what's a good evaluation question. And I know we have a couple of Q&A questions on that as well. But really just sort of at the very beginning of this, as we move forward, we'll go into much more about some of the data that people can expect and that they may have heard of, and then also understanding what it takes to actually, what you should know as you're getting involved in evaluation, whether you're hiring one or just having a better general knowledge of it. So at this point in time, what we really want to do is we want to take some of the questions that we have. We do have a few, and people please feel free to ask additional questions, and I think Candice and I can sort of go back and forth on some of them. Some of our comments as well. I think Kim mentioned a little bit, and I can't see the whole question, about students with disability.
Right. So this is Candice. Kim's comment was that one of the problems that the district was trying to address in their professional development program was to increase the students of color and women in the STEM fields. And so Kim's comment was, let's not forget about students with disabilities. So this would certainly be another group, a stakeholder group you may want to target for this scenario that we talked about. But we do have a question, actually, from Gretchen. So she's asking, what is your recommendation on the number of questions, evaluation questions, or time required to answer the evaluation? So how might we think about the number of questions that a district might ask, considering the time to answer the evaluation?
Right. I think that, and some of that there, so I'm happy to sort of weigh in a little bit on that. It really is dependent upon time and then what you're really looking at. I think in some of the work that I've done, it has really been about what is the real underlying problem that you're after, and then what you feel is most pressing. Because a lot of times people ask a lot of questions that can't be answered up front, and may just be answered over time. So I think you really have to take into consideration of that. The one thing I will say is that a lot of evaluation questions are hard to answer all at once. So you really have to sort of be careful about what you would like to answer. And think about timing of answering some of those questions. They don't all have to be answered at once, but the ones that are most important can be there. And I think there was a question a little bit earlier that was about assumptions, Candice. I think Gail mentioned where you're saying about assumptions, are they assumed to be true? Are there any thoughts on that?
Right. So I did write back to Gail in the chat, but it's worth talking out loud if people are on the phone, that we definitely would not assume the assumptions to be true. In fact, there's an entire branch of evaluation called theory-based evaluation, where you essentially try to develop questions that attack those assumptions. So you would start with the assumptions as a way to develop your evaluation questions and see if they are true. And you would be asking, are we filling in the gaps here? So if we assume that high quality professional development is required in order for this program to work, a good place to start is to do some observations of the professional development using some criteria, perhaps the Learning Forward professional learning standards, to try to assess whether or not the professional development meets a criteria of high quality, and that would be your first evaluation question. So I definitely would not assume the assumptions to be true, but getting stakeholders to articulate their assumptions is often a useful activity because it gets them to talk through the logic that's been in their heads about why we want this program. What do you think about that, Katrina?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that, you know, it really depends on what people think the assumptions are, but definitely I think people have to agree on those assumptions and to decide that they're really true. And a lot of instances, we know that assumptions sometimes aren't necessarily always backed up or true. So, but absolutely agree with that. I think there were a couple other questions as well.
Yes, we do have one here about what is the difference between the logic model and the theory of change. So thoughts about that, Katrina?
Yeah, so I actually do have some thoughts on that. So I consider the logic model as sort of the process of the theory of change. The theory of change is a little bit more theoretical about what's the theory of how people are going to react, or in the case of STEM, how will people react if we put them through STEM or if we give them more access? What's the theoretical perspective? I think the logic model is much more about getting down to the brass tacks of what it looks like, what that theory looks like in terms of concrete steps, the resources that you're going to need, the activities that you're actually going to do, what what outputs you're going to see, how many teachers are trained, how many of that. So I think as the theory changes, more the high-level theoretical concepts, and then the logic model as the actual process, concrete strategy of how to get that. Your thoughts on that, Candice? Because I know there's a lot of different thoughts out there on that.
Right. So I've seen theory of change diagrams as more like concept maps where you have multiple ideas that relate with arrows, and it's not always linear, and sometimes they can kind of go back and forth. And so there really is, there's definitely a relationship between logic model and theory of change, but often it's used to differentiate between the kinds of pictures or visuals or the templates that we use to make that theory explicit. So logic modeling has a long history of having that very specific format that we showed earlier. And in that logic model, those specific elements have, a current order, and it just helps make sense of that theory that otherwise can get really messy as you think about it.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Candice.
There's another question. Just want to make sure everybody gets their questions answered from Stephanie. Please describe the types of strategies that can be used for each level of evaluation. So I think for this, it might actually be helpful to go back to the Gusky model, which I think is what Stephanie is referring to. And also, Stephanie and everybody, I want to let you know that because this is the first part of a 3-webinar series, the next part, which is happening on November 16, is when we're going to be going into data quite a bit more. So we'll cue that up for you at the end here. But rest assured, our next session is really going to be thinking about this exact question. How would you collect data to analyze whether or not these questions were happening? So she suggests perhaps a survey at level 1, perhaps data analysis. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by data analysis, because that's actually what you do with the data, how you look at the data. But I would agree that an example of the way you could assess level 1 would be an exit ticket or a participant survey at the end of a workshop to ask them what their satisfaction was and whether they learned, whether they liked the session. And then in that same exit ticket, you could also ask them about their learning, what stands out to you from what you learned from the session today. Another way to get at learning is to do a more traditional pre and post assessment, to assess teachers before they went into the professional development. What did you know about inquiry-based science? And then afterwards, you could do another post-assessment to see if they acquired new knowledge about inquiry-based science. For level 3, which is organizational impact, you might do interviews with teachers and school administrators. You could ask the teachers, how are you receiving supports in order to plan your science lessons differently? What are those supports? You could ask the administrators, what has changed for you since the teachers went to this professional development? Are you doing anything differently in the school to accommodate the university partners? So you could collect that data through interviews. Level 4, which is implementation, I think the best way to get at teacher practice is to do observations, to actually go into classrooms and watch teachers, but we know that that can be expensive and time-consuming. So you could also get at this through surveys. You could ask teachers, which of these practices have you been able to apply in your classroom? Give me some examples. You could collect documents from teachers' classrooms. So after they've taught a science lesson, you could collect the resulting lesson plan and student work. And then level 5, which is probably the most common one, is to look at the student assessment scores. And then to also survey and interview students about their thinking about science. So has your thinking about science changed? What do you think you might do as a career now as a result of this program? So those are some examples at each of the levels of the Gusky model.
Right.
Katrina, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, and I was just about to say, I think that's a great that was a great go through, Candice, because I think the one thing that you definitely want to keep in mind is that all of the methods that Candice mentioned, they can be used at different levels, so they're not necessarily supposed to be at either level 1 or level 4 or level 5. but it's sort of what you're after at those levels. So I think that's a big key. But I think that was really nicely done, Candice, in terms of letting folks know how they sort of ramp up in terms of the questions asked and then the data that you're trying to get or the information that you're trying to get from folks.
So we want to just give some space for anybody else to ask any questions if those have come up. Keeping in mind that what we've been introduced to today is just this idea of planning and being purposeful in professional development and professional learning evaluations. So going back to this idea of planning for evaluation right at the beginning when you're starting to undertake any professional development effort, to start off with the logic model, and then to be able to articulate the boundaries of the program. What does this program try to accomplish? Why is it here? Who is involved? And then also to start thinking about the questions that you're asking should come from that logic model.
That's great.
So what other questions are on your mind for today, if any?
Right. And any other comments as well? Don't see anything just yet, but I don't, perhaps a few folks will
I see a question in the chat about whether by signing up for this webinar, are you automatically signed up for parts 2 and 3? And so we let you know, yes, you are automatically signed up, and we do hope you can join us for all 3 parts so that we can get through the rest of the 5-step model that we referred to in the beginning. So in our next session, which I mentioned is November 16 from 3 to 4:30, we're going to be really talking about understanding data in evaluation planning. And we'll do a lot more with digging into the evaluation question and thinking about the relationship between the question and the design of your evaluation and the pros and cons of different data collection methods and techniques, and how you can align the question that you're asking with the study design and the data collection. So that's going to be a big focus of our webinar, which will be happening on Thursday, November 16 from 3 to 4:30 Eastern.
Yes, and then during that time we'll also go ahead and just sort of, as Candice was saying about the design and the data, sort of shedding some light on some of the designs that you've probably heard of and sometimes wonder if they're most appropriate. So we'll try to shed some light on that as well. So today we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I think we have one last comment, though, that just came in from Salman about giving us some tools for unpacking the theory of change and logic models for stakeholders' minds. I think that was a question, Candice. So the question from Salman is, can you give us some tools? Yes, wonderful.
Yep, so I really like the 2 references that I have here at the end. If you download the slides, you'll get a link or a reference to download the Kellogg guide, which is one of the most commonly used guides for unpacking logic models. And then also the resource that was developed by our colleagues here at the REL Northeast Islands, Karen Shackman and Shayla Rodriguez, put together an entire toolkit about logic models that we are referencing today. And you can also download that. If you download the slides, you can download that toolkit. But we'll see if we can also send that to you in the chat as well.
Great. And thank you for that question, Salman. I really appreciate it. If there's no more questions, we certainly have appreciated having everyone on this webinar, and we look forward to having you on the next. If you'd like to contact us in between, you can contact both Candice and I. There's our contact information, and then you also, of course, see the IES.ed.gov Education Labs link as well, and you can certainly go there for a lot of information, but please feel free to contact us. As Candice mentioned, we'll have another webinar coming up in November, and we look forward to having everyone on that webinar. So So we do have our last bit here. We do have a large number of resources and references that helped inform today's webinar and some of the other webinars that we'll be doing. So please reference these, and then again contact us as needed about other references, and then of course contact the REL as well. And we thank you
Katrina and
for your time.
Candice. We really appreciate your presentation today, and thanks to everybody for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar recording will be archived and uploaded to IES's YouTube channel. If you registered for today's webinar, you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording when it's ready. We look forward to seeing you again at the second session in this series on November 16th. Don't forget to download today's files from the download pod, and have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.